Hello and welcome to this PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacy and I will be your host. Remember that you can ask questions anytime throughout the presentation or the Q&A section of today's webinar. If you're joining us live, just make sure you click chat in the top left-hand corner of your screen and switch the to field to everyone so all of our live viewers can see who's asking what across the country. Also, we'd love to know where you are from. If you can tack that onto your question, our guest today would love to give you maybe a more local example in his answer to your question, if that is applicable. So today's guest is Dr. Michael Fox. He is a professor at Trent University and an expert particularly in invasive species. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Stacy. And without any further ado, let's see if I can get this going. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. The topic for it is environmental threats to our Canadian waters. And I have a brief slideshow to go with the comments that I'm going to make. All right, so what I thought I would start with is a bit of a context. When we talk about Canadian waters, we probably want to start with the big picture first. And I have an excellent slide here to illustrate the context for the kind of water that we're talking about. So if you picture the globe of the Earth as representing all the water in Earth's hydrosphere, the big blue dot in the left there in the middle of the United States on that map would represent all the liquid fresh water that we have. So you can see that that's only a small percentage of that. And then the little tiny dot that's to the right of it represents all the water that is in our lakes and our rivers. And you can see that that tiny dot is less than 1%, 1 in 100th of all the fresh water that we have on Earth, which is only a small percentage of all the water, most of which is in our oceans. Now, from a Canadian context, we're actually very lucky. We have a high amount of water. We have much more of the water supply than we should have in terms of the amount of land that we have there. But there are some areas where the water isn't that well distributed, or cases where there's a lot of population relative to the water supply. And interestingly enough, given what Stacy told me about where many of you are tuning in, many of you are from areas where we don't have an abundant amount of good, clean, fresh water relative to the populations. So you see some of those red and orange marks around Toronto, in southern Ontario, and in parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and even parts of eastern BC. Now, there's a lot of way to categorize the threats to Canadian waters. The ones that I've used are mostly focused on the species that live in them. I'm a biologist myself. I study fish, so I'm obviously quite concerned about threats to our Canadian waters, and I've classified them into 4 groups. The first of them would be the development of our shorelines and our waterways in ways that actually affect the habitat in the waters, in the lakes and the streams. The second one is climate change, global warming that you've heard so much about. The third is water pollution, and there's a lot of different kinds of water pollution that we could talk about. And the fourth is invasive species, which is an area that's near and dear to my heart because I spend a lot of time studying that. Now, what I'm going to show you on the next set of slides are basically examples of all of those. They don't cover all the possible examples that you could have, and I'm hoping that if you have some concerns that aren't covered here, these will show up in questions. So let's start by talking about the development of our shorelines. And the first example that I'm going to talk about is the building of dams and weirs and reservoirs that are holding back water behind the dam. So first of all, what's the difference between a dam and a weir? The dam is a much larger structure than a weir. You can see that in the picture on the right, which is actually taken near a European city in Spain. And the little example on the left there is a weir from Cobourg Creek, Ontario, in central Ontario, not far from where I live. So what do we do? Why do we build dams and weirs? Well, the first thing is they control floods, which is very, very important in Canada in the springtime. A second very important function that dams do for us is to supply drinking water to our communities. So they hold back the water into reservoirs and we drink that water. A third is that we have hydroelectric facilities so that we get electricity from dams and reservoirs, controlling the water that comes out of it. A fourth function is that we recreate on the reservoirs that are held behind dams, so we can go fishing and boating and so on. And the fifth thing is to control invasive species. And that little weir that I showed you there is a very good example where we're worried about sea lamprey coming up the stream and affecting our trout and salmon. And this weir holds them back. So what are the main kinds of harm that dams and weirs do to animals that live in the water? Two main ones. They change the pattern of river flow, which in fact affects fish. And what I mean by that is we built these structures to control the amount of water that comes out at any given point in time. And we adjust the water that comes out in order to meet human needs, to provide sufficient drinking water, for example, to control floods, etc. And this particular dam you're looking at, by the way, is in central Alberta, not that far from Calgary. The other thing that dams do is they block fish migration unless we build passageways around this. And this is important because some fish need to go up to the headwaters of streams in order to reproduce. So when they're blocked, we lose spawning habitat, and this hurts the populations of fish that are affected in that way. Now, when we talk about pollution, often we think about toxic chemicals and so on, but it's actually quite interesting to note that the biggest kind of water pollutant that we get in the water is actually sediment. It's essentially soil that's been washed off on land, particularly in areas where the surface, where the shoreline has been cut down to allow access for animals or farm equipment or anything like that. And you see a very good example in this picture here, where you can see all this soil. It turns the water brown, and then it comes into the stream from a smaller creek. And the problem is that when that soil settles, it affects, for example, fish spawning habitat. It can choke off the eggs, which need oxygen to survive. And we have this problem in a lot of different areas that we develop. It can be farmland. It can be urban areas. It can be areas where we log them for the trees, or stream banks where we clear the vegetation in order that we can have animals water from those streams. All right, another big problem that we have is loss of habitat due to the pollution and loss of wetlands. So what is a wetland? A wetland is an area that has lots of water in the soil and that is waterlogged for at least part of the year. And in these pictures here, you see a couple of different examples. The big one on the left there are bogs that you typically get in northern parts of Canada. And the ones in the right are more marshes, which are a little more nutrient rich, that you get in more in settled parts of Canada, more in the south. Why are wetlands so important? Well, one reason is that because there's always water near the soil, these things tend to store water even when other sources of water dry up, for example, in the summer. Wetlands also provide a nursery habitat for different kinds of animals that breed in them, including fish and frogs, ducks, and many kinds of insects. And the other thing we don't really think about for wetlands, but they're very important, particularly in the south where we have pollution problems, is they act as natural filters. The sediment in them and the vegetation, they're filters. They suck up some of the pollutants in the water, and so the water that leaves it tends to be much cleaner than the water that gets in it. And despite the importance of wetlands, we've lost quite a lot of them in Canada, particularly in southern Ontario and in the prairies. A lot of them have been drained for agriculture. And of course, with global warming, the increased amount of heat causes some of them to evaporate. So we have problems because of that. Now, I mentioned heat and global warming. Of course, that brings us to the subject of climate change. And I have a couple simple graphs here that simply show, if you look at the global temperatures, how the temperatures have risen over the period of time, even in the last 100 years and more, but particularly in the last 50 years. And some of the most recent years have been some of the warmest on record. And regardless of where in the country you live, when you're tuning in on this broadcast, you know that the temperatures this winter have been very, very unusual. So the question is, well, how does that affect the plants and the animals that live in the water? So I want to say something about that. Well, one of the things that global warming does, and particularly when we combine it with a lot of the inputs of nutrients in the water that comes from sediment being washed in, and areas that we fertilize along farmlands, and that water ends up in our groundwater, and then it ends up into our surface water, we get something called eutrophication. And what that, it's a big word that basically means there's too many nutrients in the water. And you say to yourself, well, nutrients are a good thing. We all need nutrients, right? But when we get too much nutrients in the water, we promote the growth of algae in the water, and it can become quite a problem in a lot of different places because it decays. And when it decays, it not only creates a mess, you can see that in the guy's hand in the lower right, and you can see all that algae spread out on the surface of the water in the upper left. But also when it decays, it takes oxygen to break it down. And when you're taking oxygen out of the water, that's oxygen that's not available for the animals that live in the water, like fish. So we can get fish kills. All right, and the last of the four that I wanted to talk about, and this is my actual area of expertise, is invasive species. So what do we mean by an invasive species? It's a species, a plant or an animal, that doesn't come from the area where we find it. And it being from some other place, when it enters this new area, it tends to cause harm to our environment, to the other plants and animals that live around it, to our economy. It might be expensive to get rid of it or clean it up, or even in some cases, if we talk about bacteria, invasive species can harm our health. When we think about invasive species, many of them come on land, but quite a few of them come on water. And I have a little graphic here to show how invasive species have affected our Great Lakes. And since the 1800s, we now have over 100 different invasive species that have prospered in the Great Lakes. And that's only a percentage of the ones that actually got there. Those are the ones that made it and survived. And they include more than 25 different fishes, which harm some of the fishes that we fish for or that are important in our economy. So some examples of invasive aquatic species that you may or may not be familiar with. In the upper left picture, you've got these little parasites on a salmon, or on a trout actually, and these are called sea lamprey. You may have heard of them. They're bloodsuckers, and they tend to severely harm, remove the energy from, or they kill the fish that they attach to. In the upper right there, you have an example of an aquatic plant invasive species. This is Eurasian Watermilfoil, which forms these thick mats. It crowds out native plants, and it harms the environment for fish. In the lower right, you have invasive zebra and quagga mussels. We have a lot of them in the Great Lakes, and you can see how they form thick structures on many of our pipes, and they can even prevent the water from flowing, and they become very expensive to clean up. And the last example in the lower right is one that we don't know that's confirmed here. These are some of the invasive Asian carps. They're now in the Mississippi River Basin, and they're a huge problem, and we're trying to keep them out of our Great Lakes at the moment. So when we talk about invasive species, for a new fish, for example, to be introduced, it's not a slam dunk that it's going to be successful. For an invasive species to be successful, they have to be able to tolerate the conditions of the new place where you introduce them. They have to be able to start a whole population from just a few individuals that get introduced. And then they have to find mates, and they have to successfully reproduce. in order to expand their population, and they have to deal with all the new predators and competitors and diseases that are present in the new environment but didn't come from their old environment. But we have to remember that we have other threats to our waters that we've talked about before, including global warming and pollution. And in many cases, these harm our native species, and they actually create opportunities for invasive species to be successful. And maybe I'll get some questions on that we can talk about later. One of the ones that I study is a very small fish. You can see it in the hand there. It's called the round goby. They came over into the Great Lakes in 1990, and if you look at the map below with all those little red dots on there, they're all over the place now, and they're even starting to move into some places in Western Canada. They're a big problem because they're very, very abundant. You can see an example here in the lower right. They may not be a big fish, but they form very, very dense populations, and they compete with many of our other bottom-feeding species. They also eat a lot of aquatic insects that pick up pollutants, and then when bigger fish eat them, they spread pollutants to the other bigger fishes. So the kind of important questions that we would ask about invasive species and that we deal with in my lab is why an invasive species would move into a new area if it's introduced. How fast do they expand their range in the area that they get introduced? When do they move into these new areas? And how can we detect them at an early enough stage before anglers find them or before government netting programs find them so that we actually have a chance to eradicate them? And we do all those kinds of studies in my lab. And I'm going to finish here just by indicating some of the different ways that we study them in my lab. We go out in the field and we net them and fish them. And then we bring them into the lab and we do studies on their behavior and their tendencies to migrate and expand into new territories, also that we can understand them better. So I could say a lot more about invasive species and other forms of pollutants, but I'm going to stop now, turn it back over to Stacy, and invite people who are listening to this webinar to ask me any questions that they'd like to.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm glad that you could speak more about invasive species because that's where our first few questions are asking about. So we have our first question from the grade 6-7 students at John A. Leslie Public School in Scarborough, Ontario. And they would like to know, how do most invasive species enter Canada?
That's a great question. And the answer is quite often that they come unintentionally. We have some invasive species that were intentionally introduced because people thought that they might be actually a good thing. Carp are a very good example of that. Carp were introduced in the southern United States, Asian carp, a long time ago for aquaculture, but also because carp eat plants, and they were used to control the amount of aquatic vegetation that we had in the waters. For example, some of that nuisance algae. The unfortunate part about that, how they got in and they spread, was they were put in artificial ponds, but then they had flooding. And the flooding allowed them to leave the ponds and get into our natural waterways. And the big one that they got into that's now causing them to be so much problem is the Mississippi River, because the Mississippi River ends up, tributaries of the Mississippi River end up in the Great Lakes, and now we're trying to keep them out of the Canadian portion of the Great Lakes. But the other way, for example, that the gobies have come in is they've come in through trade. We have all these ships that come in from other parts of the world into the, for example, the Great Lakes. They come through the locks, and one of the ways that ships control their ability to move through the water is they use something called ballast water, where they fill up a portion of the boat at the bottom of the boat with water that either makes them sink more or float more. And when they change that ballast water in the Great Lakes, they're releasing water that was originally came from the area that they came from, for example, Eastern Europe, and they've released invasive species into the water. So that's two ways, for example, that, that invasive species have come. A third one is the pet trade. We bring them over as pets. You know, if you go to the market in Toronto, you'll see species that, particularly in the Asian market, that people like to eat, that actually, if they are released into our waters, they become invasive species.
So lots of different ways then, and most of them byproducts of how we live and what we do. Very interesting. So the next question, sort of related to that, from the grade 6 class at Gladys Spears Public School in Oakville, Ontario. They're asking, how do researchers trace where and how invasive species finds their way into our communities?
Okay, again, a very good question. And there are different ways. One of them is, if we're talking about fish, for example, anglers find them. So anglers, they're trying to catch something that they want, and they pull up something that they don't know. So they might then phone the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and say, what is this fish? And lo and behold, we now discover that there's a new fish that wasn't supposed to be in the water. And I think that's probably how they were first discovered around gobies in the Great Lakes, through anglers fishing them. But we also have ministries in all parts of Canada that deal with fisheries. They have survey programs. And so they're trying to survey the health of our water bodies and our fisheries. And they have regular netting programs, and they find them. So those are two ways that they're quite commonly found.
Excellent. More questions about invasive species, so right up your alley. Mr. Finley's grade 6 class at Gladys Spears Public School would like to know, what are the most invasive species to our waterways here in Canada? Okay.
Well, actually, some of the worst ones that we have were examples that I showed on that one slide. From the point of view of plants, probably Eurasian Watermilfoil is about the worst one. It comes from Eastern Europe. It's been in North America for a long time. And if you happen to be a cottager, particularly in central Canada, a lot of the area around which the people in the Toronto area are asking these questions, a lot of the lakes have this in there. And when you get infestations, the plant grows very, very quickly. And, you have this nice shoreline, which you were happily, you had sand beach and all this. And now the next thing you know, it's all clogged up full of plants. And then you want to take your boat into the water, and the next thing you know, so it's all thick and full of this vegetation, and it all gets caught around your motor, and it stops your motor. Or it has to be cleaned off every 5 minutes when you're motoring through the water. But the part we don't see, of course, is the harm that it does to the native plants and the animals in the water as well. So it's not just people; it's other fish and wildlife. Some other important ones that I showed: the sea lamprey. That's a big one because sea lampreys are parasites. They originally came from the ocean. They migrated up the Great Lakes, and they got into all the different Great Lakes as a result of all the locks and dams that we have built. And they're a big problem because they attack salmon and trout, which our fisheries harvest, and which local recreational fishers like to catch and eat. And they've had a big impact, mortality impact on all those salmon and trout. And as a result, both the federal government and the ministries have spent millions and billions of dollars to try to fight them.
So that maybe brings me to a question we have about what to do. What, in your opinion, what would be the best avenue for money spent if there was a single initiative by our government? What should they, in your opinion, do to help with the problem of invasive species?
Okay. Well, if we think about it for individual invasive species, the answer is different. In some cases, once they're here, there's very little we can do other than to stop them from spreading from other places. And our ministries across Canada and our federal government all have developed programs to try to minimize or prevent that spread. And so, for example, in Ontario, they have these washing stations. I believe they have them in Alberta as well. Those are places that I know about. So what happens is if you're taking your boat from an area, for example, where you have Eurasian Watermilfoil, what they want you to do is wash off your boat before you put that boat into another place. So that's one thing that they do. The other is they have awareness programs, so that what they try to do is get people aware of the main invasive threats that we have in different parts of the country, so that people who are out and have the opportunity to observe these things can report them at an early enough stage where we can at least fight them locally. And when I say fight them locally, what I mean is that some invasive species, once they're well established, there's not much you can do about them in the area where they're established. So the most important thing is to just confine them to that area and not allow them to spread all over the place.
And from our students in Ottawa, they'd like to know if there are any particularly effective ways to exterminate an invasive species. We talk a lot about confining them. Is there a good way to exterminate a problematic species?
It really depends on the species. So if we go back to the sea lamprey, for example, there is a way to exterminate them. There's been a chemical that we have been using for many, many years now. Its initials are TFM. It has a long chemical name. And what you do is you apply this to the parts of streams in the Great Lakes watershed. This is where they're of most concern, where the animals come up to breed. It's called a lampricide because what it does is it kills the eggs and the young when they hatch. So we've been using that for many years to try to control sea lamprey, and we've been pretty successful with it. The big problem is that it does have some unintended consequences on other parts of the ecosystem. So more recently, there have been trying to do new ways of controlling sea lamprey, and one of them is that Weir of the kind that I showed in that picture earlier on Coburg. So what happens with that Weir is that the lamprey, when they're coming up to breed, they're not like salmon, they can't jump a weir. So what they end up doing is to try to get up the stream, they'll come into this box, which is set up particularly to capture them along the stream. And if I were to go back to that picture, you would see there's one of these boxes that's been set up by the government on the right, and this confines them, and then they can be captured and killed. So they never make it upstream. So those are some examples. But there are other species, like ground goby. Once they're there, you really can't eradicate them. They're so dense, and they're like a needle in a haystack. So what we've done is develop new techniques to discover them when there's such low density that they can be controlled. And this is before anglers catch them or before netting programs catch them. And it's quite interesting how you do this. You collect samples of DNA in the water. You collect water samples, you analyze them for DNA, the material of reproduction in the water, and each animal has a particular signal that can be picked up in the DNA. So if we discover the DNA and we don't see the animals, we know this is an area where we can go in and try to eradicate them before they spread.
Interesting. We now have a question from Calgary, Alberta. Can invasive species affect our drinking water?
Yeah, they can. I would say that the bigger concern when we talk about invasive species and making water clear to drink, first of all, we get these algae blooms. And sometimes those algae blooms can be toxic. And I know we've had these in the Great Lakes. We've had them in marine waters. I'm not quite certain whether we've had them in Western Canada or not. Not sure about the answer to that. But there are also, when we think about invasive species, we tend to think of things we can see, but there are also things we can't see, like bacteria and viruses. And very definitely they have the potential to affect the drinking water, but by and large we have ways of dealing with them, at least so that they're not harmful, because any drinking water that you get is certainly in a city, it's filtered, and if you're taking it off of farmland, then usually it goes through some kind of filter to get those kinds of things out as well. But now, since this person is from Calgary, I'll give them an example. When I go backpacking in the Rocky Mountains, and I go out west to Western Canada quite often to do this, Once upon a time, it used to be safe in streams to just dip your water bottle in the water and just drink right from the stream. But now, because of concerns with bacteria, some of them are invasive and some of them are natural but have been made worse by water pollution, all the water has to be filtered first. It's no longer safe unless you're in an area where there's nobody around, absolutely nobody around. The water has to be filtered now.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the algal blooms, because we have a question from the Townsend class in Simcoe, Ontario, and they would like to know what plans are in place to help prevent possible algae blooms from recurring in the Great Lakes, especially in Lake Erie this summer.
Right, and if I remember right, there are issues with algae blooms in Lake Simcoe as well. So that's even closer to those folks. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I know what they specifically do. You can control, to a limited extent, you can control blooms with chemicals, but then chemicals usually have some other kinds of negative side effects. Sometimes, if the algae are not microscopic, you can collect them in nets and things like that. So sometimes you can locally control them. But I think the main way that they try to control algae blooms is to not feed the algae with too much nutrients. And that comes back to that slide I had on eutrophication. Hopefully everybody will remember that, when you get too much nutrients in the water. And the two main ways to control the amount of nutrients that you get in the water, and we're mostly talking about phosphorus and nitrogen, is you try to put up buffer areas. You make sure that you have good vegetation, typically about 30 meters along the shoreline of your creeks and your streams. There are programs to control nutrients off of farmlands that are sponsored by government agencies like OMAF in Ontario. And programs to collect, for example, some of the organic, the feces, for example, that come off of animals, where you have animals grazing. All those are important sources for nitrogen and phosphorus. And then, of course, programs to control the purification of drinking water. When the drinking water comes out, it becomes sewage, and we have to hold that in sewage treatment plants and treat it so that we can, if we treat it enough for something called tertiary sewage treatment, so that we actually take out some of the nutrients, then the water that leaves those sewage treatment plants and goes into our streams and lakes has lower amounts of nutrients in it.
Excellent. Well, I know we're already a little bit over time. I'm going to wrap up here with a few more questions we haven't had a chance to get to yet. We have a question from the Whitney Public School in Ontario. They want to know, what is the most dangerous invasive species we have in the Great Lakes?
Most dangerous?
I guess it depends on how you define danger here.
Right. Well, I think the one that could end up being the most dangerous is the one that we don't have here yet, which are these Asian carps. The silver and the big head carp that they have in the United States. For those of you who are listening, if you haven't already done this and you want to see what the size and how dangerous they can be, Google jumping carp. And you'll see a video. There's different videos that are out there, anywhere from 2 to 7 minutes. You're talking about animals that can weigh as much as 100 pounds, sometimes more. And when you operate a motor in the water, it scares these things, and so they jump up and they hit fishermen. I mean, people had their jaws broken. They've been seriously injured just by getting smacked in the chest or in the face from these carp. And they're so abundant in the water where they occur, they crowd out other species as well. So they're harmful to other species, but they're also harmful to people who are in the water, who are recreational boating or angling or any of this kind of thing. Physically harmful.
Wow,
we don't have them yet, or at least it's not confirmed that we have them yet, and we're depending on an electric barrier that the Americans are operating near Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, to keep them out of our part of the Great Lakes.
Very interesting strategy too to keep them out, but it's hard to imagine for me a fish that large that lives in the interior of the continent. We kind of think of those as ocean fish get that large, but I digress. Let's move on to other people's questions here who've joined us today. The McKinley grade 7 class at James Strath in Peterborough, Ontario, not too far from you. They would like to know if invasive species can benefit our environment.
Hypothetically, they can, and remember, it all comes in the definition. We have a lot of non-native species that have been purposely introduced, even in Ontario, but all across the country. In the case of fish, which is what I mostly study, they've been introduced to provide a fishery. So if you happen to be down in one of the Great Lakes, like Lake Ontario, or any of the feeder streams, like many of my students will go to fish those in the spring and in the fall, you'll be able to capture different kinds of Pacific salmon that don't belong in the Great Lakes. They were purposely introduced. We introduced them to provide a fishery, or rainbow trout's another example. Rainbow trout are native to the people in Western Canada, but they're not native here. They've been introduced, and they've been introduced on part to provide a fishery. Brown trout is another example. Brown trout's a European species. It's not native to anywhere here. We don't classify them invasive because by definition, the term invasive also includes harmful.
Interesting. So I guess from that definition then, most or all invasive species would not be beneficial overall. They wouldn't be classified as invasive if they were beneficial.
Right, except it gets interesting. If we take the example of brown trout or rainbow trout, they do compete with our native brook trout, so they're harmful to our native species in that sense. And the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry regulates where they are permitted to be introduced so that there are still refugia for our native brook trout. So although they do provide a fishery, and a lot of people who fish for them are happy that they're there, that doesn't make them have no harm to anything. Anything you introduce is likely to have some potential effect to the plants and animals that are native.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in a couple more questions here. We have Tony at Parkview PS in Markham. He wants to know, have invasive species affected some of the fisheries in Lake Ontario, like cod or trout, as you just mentioned?
Okay. Well, first of all, cod would not be a native fish in Lake Ontario. Cod is a marine fish, so we get that in the Atlantic Ocean. And as far as I know, I've never heard of cod actually coming into fresh waters. I don't think they could live there. But in terms of, yes, our native trout and salmon, the biggest one that has impacted them is the sea lamprey. Or actually, I should say the biggest thing that's impacted some of our trout and salmon is people by overfishing for them. But that's now regulated, and the biggest problem is the sea lamprey and the amount of mortality that they inflict, the harm that they do on things like lake trout that we fish for, any of those Pacific salmon that we've introduced that are important fisheries in Lake Ontario, for example. And also some of the trout species, including our native brook trout and lake trout.
So one more class here. We haven't gotten to one of their questions yet. I really want to squeeze it in. We've got Ms. Payne's class in Toronto, and they're asking if you could please give an example of how a native species deals with an invasive species. So perhaps, have you seen any changes in native species that help them when an invasive species is introduced?
That is a great question, and there's a whole lot of studying that goes on with that. So one of the ways that, natural ways that we're able to control invasive species is because of the native predators. And so if I take the round goby as an example, round goby do spread, and they become very, very dense. fish that live on the bottom have to compete against them. And although they might reduce their population somewhat, they can fight back because they're more accustomed to the predators, to the parasites, to the diseases and the other kinds of things in their native water. So often what we see happens when invasive species first come to an area, they erupt, meaning that their populations grow very, very quickly. And often in aquatic environments, it's a 7-year cycle. So it takes them about 5 or 6 or 7 years before they really become super, super dense. And then after that, their populations drop because the natives are fighting back. And the natives fighting back can be the competitors, but also the predators. So if we take the goby, largemouth bass eat gobies. They eat lots of them. So that's one of the ways that the native species fight back.
It's very interesting that it takes sort of that reliable amount of time for the native species to learn and come back.
Well, here's a good analogy, okay? So if you think about, I introduce somebody in our audience to some food that they've never seen before and comes out of, say, China or Northern Europe or the Arctic or something like that. You put that on their plate and they look at that and it doesn't look familiar to them because they've never eaten it before and they don't know whether it's going to taste good, they don't know whether it's poisonous or anything like that. So they might initially avoid it. And it takes even the predators a little while to get the idea that, oh my gosh, we have something in here that's a new source of food for me. It takes a little time for that to happen.
Very interesting. Now, we have talked entirely about invasive species so far, and our audience asked almost entirely questions about invasive species. But we have one question that I thought we might get to earlier, but I'm going to squeeze it in now. Ms. Montgomery's class at Guy Brown's School in Waterdown wanted to know how we can save our wetlands in Ontario.
Okay. There are a lot of initiatives for saving wetlands. And I'm actually watching in Peterborough itself some very good examples of local public fighting back against development, because in many cases, wetlands to developers are just temporary obstructions. And they often occur in areas where they can build houses and there's a lot of pressure to build houses. They can buy the land cheap, drain the wetlands, build structures on there, and then sell the houses and make a lot of money. And some of our local communities are fighting back against this. And we do have some tools. We not only can, we have organizations, for example, in Peterborough, the Peterborough Field Naturalists is very vigilant about wetlands because they know the importance of them for birds and fish and amphibians and so on. And when a developer proposes to develop an area, one of the first things they look for are tools that the ministry allows for the classification of wetlands, because we have policies in Ontario and all across Canada for the conservation and in many cases even the preservation of wetlands that are given a high classification, meaning that they're considered to be significant wetlands. So once that happens, it gives members of the public a tool for fighting this development. And if we can fight the development, then we can keep the wetlands there instead of the houses going over on top of it.
Excellent. So there are avenues here for advocacy and for utilizing the policies that our government has set in motion and put in play to classify these areas and save them.
Absolutely, but for all the people out there listening to this, the most important thing to note is that individuals make all the difference. The difference between an area being paved over and developed or an area that's been set aside as a local park and for use and enjoyment of people is often comes down to just one very vigilant individual who cares and starts a campaign to try to stop a particular development. And that's what we're seeing in Peterborough.
Good. Well, and good for our students to know that sometimes I'm sure it feels like you can't, but that one person really can make a difference. So thank you for that. And thank you for all of the other wisdom you've imparted on us today based on your expertise, particularly in invasive species, and joining us from the School of the Environment and the Department of Biology at Trent University.
Okay, thank you very much. And I hope that the members of the different schools out there got something out of it.
I'm sure they did. I know I did, so I'm sure that all of our students did as well. We did have a few thank yous come in for the new learning, and we had our grade 6s at Gladys Spears said that they learned what a weir is today. So definitely some learning going on. Just before we sign off, next up on PIR Live Event, we're talking about engineers as problem solvers next week. More information on this and other upcoming PIR Live Event webinars is available at pirweb.org. Thanks for joining, everyone. We'll see you next time.